Hi there, Phil the Practical Gardener. This particular topic is about suitable containers for growing your seedlings in. And I'm going to be discussing this from the context of the surface area of the container that you use, the depth that you would require, drainage issues to do with humidity, and perhaps some special needs. I'll also discuss some accessories that you might need, such as a drainage tray, a heat pad, and also perhaps some protection from animals, such as this one here, who is a little pest and always wants to be in the videos. Without more ado, let's get into it. Now, in reality, a vast range of materials can actually be used as containers to grow plants in, or seeds, which is what I'm focusing in here. For example, egg boxes can be used, a yogurt container, as long as you punch some holes in the base, a takeaway punnet, and even things I understand such as the core or the husk of a citrus fruit that you've hollowed out and you can plant in, and then you would then plant the whole thing into the ground. I haven't tried this one, but it does sound quite interesting. That's a useful, biodegradable, environmentally sustainable method that you could use. On a similar line, by the way, there are peat pots that you can use, and I'm showing some here. First of all, one that has got 10 cells within it, and you can grow the seedlings, 1 or 2 within each of the cells, and then you would break each of them off from its neighbours, and you would plant the whole thing into the soil. The peat itself would then feed the soil over time and improve it. Just a little word of warning here, when you planted that out, I would break the sides of the container down so that it was level with the surface of the soil. Otherwise the moisture within the pot might wick up into the air and the seedling might actually dry out quicker than the soil around it. I also show peat cells, which are actually totally made out of the peat, and they do a similar purpose, and also larger peat pots that again you could use for larger seeds, such as, for example, this avocado seed here. By the way, I wouldn't particularly recommend that you grow avocados from seed. They're easily obtained and they grow very, very easily, and a lot of people do grow them this way. However, they're almost always disappointing, and the reason is because the plant that this grew from was a selected form which was grafted onto a rootstock, and it would be of a superior type, and also it will fruit quite quickly. If you planted that in the ground, it will usually fruit within about 2 years. If you simply plant the seedling and you grow that in your garden, so the small plant that you planted, you're probably going to be 5 up to maybe 10 or even 20 years before that fruits, because the rootstock would encourage the plant to be more precocious, that is, it would fruit earlier. So I don't really recommend that. However, you could use that larger container for things such as a walnut or a pecan that you might wish to grow. Now we'll talk a little bit about the surface area. So you can see this one here where I've actually sown a broad lot of seeds. This is basil in this one here, and this is capsicums that I'm actually planting or sowing a lot of these, so therefore I want something with a wide surface area. This one here is around about 40 centimeters by 30. You don't need that for a lot of things when you're only growing a few seeds, so you could actually just use the smaller punnets that I just mentioned before. However, I do use these larger ones for ones that I do grow a lot of, such as onions. Very, very suitable for that. However, smaller amounts of seedlings such as spring onions, as I'm showing here, you can actually simply sow a few. I sow these into a 6-cell container, and I can simply knock them out and then divide them to grow them on. However, the main onion crop, that is the brown or the red onions, I do a mass sowing. The next topic is the depth. Now you can see that this container that I showed earlier is not really very deep, and in fact I've sown the seed well down into the container. The soil only goes up to about there, or the media I should say, not soil. The reason is because most seedlings actually have a very limited amount of root system before you prick them out into a larger container or plant them out or whatever. There is a danger if you have too much depth that it might get wet and anaerobic down the bottom, and that would actually be bad for the seedlings and could cause disease. So generally I suggest a shallower amount of media, around about 50 millimeters or 2 inches. My next topic is drainage. You do need to have very good drainage for these things for the same reason that I'm mentioning before. You can see here that this container, which is one of my food ones, has got lots and lots of small drainage holes, and also these holes are actually lifted above the rim of the container. These are the ridges which actually sit on the bench, and these are the drainage holes. They're actually raised up so it allows free drainage. You don't want them hard down on the surface of, say, a plastic or concrete or whatever surface that you might be putting these on. That would impede the drainage. That can be a little bit of an issue if you're using a homemade container such as a takeaway punnet. In that case there, you might need to poke holes in it and then put something like some small stones under it to lift it above the hard surface that you would be putting it on. This container I showed earlier with the spring onions, you can see the drainage holes are on the side there, so therefore that allows the drainage. So that area there sits flat on the surface, but there is actually plenty of drainage. The next topic I'll talk about is humidity, and that's not normally a huge issue with these ones that I'm growing here. However, you can buy specialised propagation units from garden centres, and I'm showing one here. You can see that it's got a base part and then a lid that fits over the top, and these are really more suitable for growing cuttings than seeds. You'll notice that with this one I'm showing you that there is in fact no drainage in the base, so you would need to put the seeds into a container within that. You have to be careful about the lid because the lid will retain a lot of humidity. Now you do need your seeds and seedlings to be moist, however you don't really want high humidity. If you do, you will encourage a disease called damping off, which is a fungus disease that will spread very, very quickly through your seedlings and actually destroy them and be very hard to control. So therefore I don't really recommend these types of units for seedlings. You will see in the top that there are actually ventilation hatches that you can release to open them. However, the humidity would still be much higher than in an area such as this here, which is my open terrace. Now I'm just going to discuss a few accessories you might need. For a start off, you might need a drainage tray such as this one here, so you could actually sit your punnets on there. If you were growing your seedlings inside for some reason, you would need to do something there to catch the moisture so it didn't damp the surfaces of your beautiful house. However, you wouldn't want to keep water sitting on that for any length of time. It would create anaerobic conditions in the soil and also increase the humidity. Another useful accessory would be a heat pad. You plug it into the mains power, then you can simply put the plant on it, and usually these ones will actually maintain their own temperature without the need for an external thermostat or such like. This year I didn't actually put my tomato seedlings on a heat pad. I have got quite a large heat pad in my greenhouse, however I had actually covered it with other plants, so I didn't use that to sow my tomatoes, and I actually had a very poor strike or germination on those tomatoes. So that's a little lesson for me in future. Although I had no problem with the capsicums that you can see here, or the basil, which have similar warmth requirements, the tomatoes, which were these ones here, were more of a failure, and I had to do a re-sowing. The final topic that I wanted to discuss was the need for animal protection, and you can see Mipsy going up and down this whole time. What I do is I put materials such as this over my trays. I've really got a range of just netting hoops and such like that I do to protect them from animals, cats, dogs, birds and such like. So that's the range of topics that I wanted to cover for this particular one. You will see that on my playlist 13 I have got a range of different tips, most of which I've created and I'm working on the rest right now. This one here about suitable containers, also the sort of media that you should use for growing your seedlings. Next, the sowing itself, then the pricking out or growing on, and then the planting them out into the garden. And there are a few issues to discuss, so I do suggest you look at these if you're growing things from seed. I'll also be producing one about sowing directly into the garden, and then a few other more specialist topics such as sowing the seed in the cold season. And don't forget that I have a full range of playlists about all aspects of gardening and also landscaping, so do look at those if you've got a topic of interest to you. Don't forget to like this because I do need these likes to help my channel to grow. Also comments or questions that you might have about the containers or other aspects about sowing and growing seeds for your garden. And finally, of course, thanks very much for viewing this through to the end.